You know the story. A wife who was carrying pitchers of water to Continental soldiers in the heat of battle is struck by the sight of her husband falling wounded next to his cannon, and she rushes to her love's side. Her husband is why she is here. He was a soldier, and she refused to leave the love of her life's side. She planned to follow him through hell and back, and this is hell. Once reaching her wounded husband, she noticed that when he was struck, he wasn't able to finish loading the cannon that he was manning. The powder charge still sat in the muzzle of the great gun, and the rod was lying next to her groaning husband on the ground. She quickly comforted him with a gentle caress of her soft hands as smoke filled the air and bullets flew through the sky. With a smile, she looked tenderly at her husband and assured him that she will avenge him. Suddenly, the water pitcher fell from her hand, and she reached for the rod. The heroine quickly jammed the powder bundle into the cannon and called for the ammunition, which was brought to her by her husband's fellow cannoneers. Once the cannon was set, the now stern wife pointed into the lines of the enemy as she commanded for her husband's men to fire. With a loud boom from the muzzle, followed by a flash of sparks and light, Molly Pitcher was born. Despite the story we have all been told and taught, historians really have no idea who Molly Pitcher really was. There are several people who have similar descriptions throughout history as the legendary war hero Molly Pitcher, but only two come close and are recognized historically as the women who most likely inspired the legend. Ironically, both women have connections to South Central Pennsylvania, and more specifically, the Cumberland Valley. Let's explore these two women and ask, will the real Molly Pitcher please stand up? Many of you may be thinking, why in the world was a woman on the battlefield in the 18th century during the American Revolution? Well, actually, it isn't as uncommon as what you may think. At the time, many women served on the battlefield in roles that at the time were traditionally women roles. Many women served as nurses, laundresses, cooks, and served in other domestic roles, keeping the soldiers company. Even some of these camp followers provided sexual services to the men, being legitimate, being with their husbands, or illegitimate as being women of ill repute. Sometimes these women attended to the army because they were just too poor to fend for themselves, as their husbands were off to war. So they made themselves useful in camp and also along the battlefront. Women were quite common to see along with the troops of the Continental Army, so much so that General Washington himself complained about them. He commented in 1777 that the multitude of women in particular are a clog upon every movement. Unfortunately for Washington, he could not get rid of them, for if he did, the men would desert the army, which was something that Washington was trying to avoid at all costs and at all the time. Also, the roles that the women played were necessary and actually useful, so of course, Washington had to let them stay. But would one of these women go so far as to man a cannon in battle? The truth is, yes. Mary Ludwig was born in either Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or in New Jersey to a family of German immigrants on October the 13th, 1754. Her family background was very poor, in which her father and mother had very little money and were uneducated immigrants. Mary Ludwig was illiterate because of this and could not read nor write. She married William Hayes, a barber, and like many immigrants at the time, went west to make a life for themselves. They settled in the growing town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm at here today, in one of their old graveyards here. With the outbreak of the American Revolution, William Hayes joined Proctor's Pennsylvania Artillery, which became Proctor's Artillery of the Continental Army. His wife, Mary, soon followed him by joining the artillery unit in 1777 as a camp follower, most likely because she could not support herself with her husband in war, like so many other camp followers during the American Revolution. Now, Mary's duties ranged from cook to laundress to nurse, and even serving during the cold winter months camped at Valley Forge. But a camp follower for an artillery unit had a different responsibility. To swab out a cannon, the cannoneers required water to douse the sparks from the last shot, so when they reinserted powder into the hot barrel, it didn't immediately ignite the powder and kill the loading cannoneer. This is where pitchers of water would come in handy, and Mary Hayes, who was a camp follower for an artillery unit, most likely carried these pitchers. Because Molly is a common nickname for Mary, the story goes that the soldiers would call for her to bring water by yelling, "Molly, pitcher." Supposedly the name stuck. Mary Ludwig Hayes was supposedly described by the men of her company as an illiterate, pregnant 22-year-old woman who chewed and smoked tobacco and could swear and curse as much as one of the soldiers that she helped take care of. On the very hot summer day of June 28, 1778, Washington's Continental Army, along with Proctor's artillery, participated in the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. Supposedly, Mary was running pitchers of water from two nearby springs to her husband and his fellow artillerymen for drinking and for swabbing the cannons during the heat of battle. Her husband, William, then collapsed, either because of a wound or because of the heat exhaustion that was affecting a lot of the men that day. Either way, Mary rushed to the cannon so it would not be taken off the field due to its loss of manpower, and she began helping to work the cannon. A description of a woman at the cannon during the Battle of Monmouth was mentioned in the writings of Private Joseph Plum Martin, who described a woman at Monmouth with the following passage. A woman whose husband belonged to the artillery and who was then attached to a piece in the engagement attended with her husband at the piece for the whole time, while in the act of reaching for a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step. A cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case it might have carried away something else and continued her occupation. The story goes so far to say that George Washington himself inquired about this woman at the cannon, and he personally thanked her for her bravery. Some sources go so far to say that he promoted her to sergeant. Unfortunately, William Hayes passed away in 1789 due to complications from his battle wounds that he suffered during the war. Mary Hayes soon remarried to George Macaulay. 44 years after her heroic showing at the Battle of Monmouth, Pennsylvania awarded her an annual pension for her services. Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay passed away on January the 22nd, 1833, and was buried here at the old graveyard in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In 1876, Cumberland County, Pennsylvania honored Molly Pitcher with a monument, which is right behind me here, in her honor that is over her gravesite here in this graveyard, commemorating her picking up that swab and ramrod and making her stand at Monmouth nearly 100 years before. But, is this the true Molly Pitcher? According to an article done for the Smithsonian, there's a lot of holes in the story of Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay. Much of the story of her being the lady at Monmouth was most likely told in the 1800s after her death and not during her life. Though her husband did serve in Proctor's artillery, there is really no record to show that she was on the battlefield that day. Private Martin's story of the woman aiding her artilleryman husband is possibly true, though maybe exaggerated, but it does not directly tie Mrs. Hayes Macaulay to being that woman on the battlefield. Plus, Private Martin's account of women manning cannons during battle was a common story by many other soldiers in many other battles throughout the Revolutionary War. Is it possible it was just a crude sexual joke among the ranks? We might not never know. But the story about Washington meeting with her and thanking her for her service stems from Washington's adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis, who in an 1840 article first discussed this part of the story of Molly Pitcher, but most likely this was only a story and not really a family testimonial. There is no mention of it by Washington, nor a record of her receiving an official rank of sergeant, as some of the stories claim. In 1822, Mary Hayes Macaulay officially applied for a pension as a widow of a veteran, which she was rewarded. Rather than that pension saying upon approval that it was for a widow, it said for services rendered, which was not the official reason why it was filed. It is possible that Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay did a majority of what has been ascribed to her, especially here on this monument. Of course that is possible, but do we have enough proof to claim it for an historical fact? Not really. Yet Mary is credited as the official Molly Pitcher in most of America's textbooks by historians. But there is another Molly Pitcher who may fit the description better than Mary Macaulay, and we have historical proof of this one's heroism. On November 12th, 1751, Margaret Cochran was born in modern-day Lurgan Township in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm at right now. This is actually the Lurgan Township Lions Club Community Center and Park. Born on the Pennsylvania frontier, bordering the Allegheny Mountains that separate the British province and its European inhabitants from the Native American tribes to the west, young Margaret grew up in a rough backwood community here. In 1755, the Native American war parties from the west began to attack the Pennsylvania frontier as a result of the British losses in a failed attempt to attack French Fort Duquesne in the west. The French and Indian War had hit the doorstep of young Margaret, literally. Though we cannot identify her mother and father within history, it is believed that her father was killed in a Native American raid during this time period, and her mother was carried off into captivity, never to be heard from again. Margaret and her brother avoided capture, for they were not home at this time of the raid that took their mother and father. They were most likely away living or visiting with their uncle. Around 1772, Margaret married John Corbin, a man we know little about except that he hailed from Virginia and was supposedly a farmer. Early in the Revolutionary War, John joined the ranks of the Continental Army as an artilleryman in Proctor's Pennsylvania Artillery, the same artillery unit that the Hayeses later joined. John's wife Margaret, being childless and most likely unable to support herself, joined along with him. Now, we are unable to determine in what capacity that she joined the military. Some believe she joined as a camp follower, much as Mary Hayes was claimed to be, where Margaret most likely also carried water for the men to drink and to swab out their cannons in Proctor's artillery. Now, according to some, Margaret was actually described as a foot soldier who wore a uniform but never concealed her sex, fighting alongside her husband in battle, just as any soldier would. Either one of these could be true. There are many instances during the war of women serving as camp followers, but there are also some instances where women dressed and acted like the male soldiers fighting for independence, though most of those cases would see that these women soldiers hid the fact that they were women. Besides, Margaret lived a hard, orphaned life here on the frontier. She would have grown up rough and headstrong, traits of her Scottish heritage. It is quite possible she was willing and able to fight as a soldier, even at a time that those behaviors was unheard of for a woman. Either way, Margaret appears to be well known throughout the ranks as a woman. Patriotic literature referred to her as Captain Molly later in her service. Margaret and John found themselves at the Battle of Fort Washington in New York. Fort Washington was the last stronghold of the Continental Army on New York's Manhattan Island. Things were not going well for General Washington on Manhattan. Under cover of darkness, his forces barely escaped the British as they were swarming New York City, and the remainder of his forces that were left in the area collected at Fort Washington to defend the strategic location, despite the general's orders to abandon it. The British attack commenced on November the 16th, 1776, coming from both land and sea. John, manning a cannon in the battle, was struck and killed. With the cannoneer team lacking the manpower to properly load and fire the great gun, Margaret Corbin stepped up to fill in for her fallen husband. Now put yourself in Margaret's shoes, if she had any at the time. It's winter, it's cold, the soldiers of the Continental Army are malnourished and lacking basic necessities at this time, such as coats, shirts, and yes, even shoes. These hardships would have most likely equally affected the women accompanying the soldiers, and possibly even worse than the soldiers' effects. You just watched your spouse die in combat. You have already suffered death as your family were killed and captured while you were young. The mental trauma alone would have been devastating. All this occurring nearly 2 years before Mary Hayes's supposed exploits at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. As Margaret manned the cannon and her dead husband at her feet, the British closed in on the Continental force, eventually forcing the commander of that force, which was Colonel Robert McGaw, to surrender. At the end of the battle, Margaret was wounded and now was made a combat prisoner of the British. There is far more historical evidence to back up Margaret Corbin's claim to the name of Molly Pitcher than there is for Mary Ludwig Hayes. According to the Daughters of the American Revolution, Margaret was hit with 3 musket balls and grape shot. Her left arm was reported nearly severed from her body, and she had terrible wounds on her jaw and on her breasts. Wounds, nonetheless, that were bad enough to make her disabled in some capacity. Margaret was released by the British after her capture at Fort Washington and reassigned to the Corps of the Invalids, located in West Point, which was an American stronghold overlooking the Hudson, upriver from New York City at the time. She was listed on the discharge rolls of the Invalid Regiment when she was discharged in April of 1783, almost 7 years after she received her wounds. Her main duty during this time was most likely guard duty. This shows that Margaret was treated as a soldier for much of the war, not a camp follower. Though Margaret's story never included a personal praise by General George Washington, the officers of her regiment petitioned the Continental Congress to give Corbin a pension for her services and her obvious sacrifices in the name of independence. In the papers of the Continental Congress dated July 6, 1779, the Continental Congress resolved that Margaret Corbin, who was wounded and disabled in the attack on Fort Washington, whilst she heroically filled the post of her husband, who was killed by her side serving a piece of artillery, do receive, during her natural life or the continuance of the said disability, the 1/2 of the monthly pay drawn by a soldier in the service of these states, and that she now received out of the public stores 1 complete suit of clothes, or the value thereof in money. Margaret's monthly disability pay was probably about $2 a month. This Continental Congress resolve provides historical evidence of Margaret's presence and actions at Fort Washington, and even provides her name, something that Mary Ludwig Hayes does not officially have. This also gives Margaret the distinction of being the first woman veteran of the United States of America. Margaret Corbin eventually moved to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, most likely with relatives from her girlhood home here in the Cumberland Valley and in Lurgan. As these Scotch-Irish immigrants moved from this area and moved further west after the defeat of the Native Americans that once occupied the land and attacked so many here on the Pennsylvania frontier. Margaret died January the 16th, 1800, as a result of her war injuries. She was 48 years old. Margaret's burial is still a mystery. Though most likely dying in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1926 supposedly found her body in New York. It was reinterred at the Military Academy at West Point, which she served out of the majority of her time in the Continental Army. She has the distinction to be the only Revolutionary War soldier to be buried on the grounds of West Point. However, when Margaret's grave was accidentally disturbed in 2016 during restorations in the West Point Cemetery, the body was removed and taken for analysis at Binghamton University. It was discovered by anthropology experts that the body reinterred in 1926 was actually an unknown male soldier and not that of a woman. The Daughters of the American Revolution still search for Margaret's grave to this day, with the hope of giving her the honored burial that she deserves. Rather, the real Molly Pitcher was Mary Ludwig Hayes or Margaret Corbin or one of the other brave women that were present on the battlefields of American independence. It really isn't important. Molly Pitcher is none of them, and yet she's all of them. These women who cleaned and repaired clothes, hauled water to thirsty men or flaming cannons, cooked food within camp, provided medical care to the wounded, provided the creature comforts of home, picked up a musket or a rifle, jammed powder down a cannon barrel, or even marched shoulder to shoulder with her husbands and comrades in arms. They were all Molly Pitchers. Where Mary's legend and Margaret's history may have been two sources that inspired the story of the wife manning the cannon of her fallen husband, the story of Molly Pitcher was more than that scene. It was an American woman who gave her all to contribute to the fight for freedom, a freedom that, for her sex, will come far later than her counterparts. An American woman who, in desperation, suffered greatly for something beyond her scope or place at that time. An American woman who considered something greater before considering herself. Though inscribed with Mary Hayes' name and sitting on top of her grave, this statue behind me should be viewed as a monument dedicated to not just one individual, but the true Molly Pitchers, all those women who performed so gallantly for the American cause. Though the true roles and actions of these women were kind of forgotten throughout history due to the sexism of their time, the legend of Molly Pitcher successfully passed on to posterity the expression of their bravery and importance by creatively forming one story and one figure that encompassed them all. Thank you for watching. If you wish to see more, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks you once again. Please also view my sources in the comments. Remember, these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep these stories alive. See you next time as I explore what in the history.